Great, yeah. Hello everybody. It's great that I have the opportunity to talk a little bit about my research and my field of research to you. So as Anne said already, I will focus more on the area of sustainable development and education for sustainable development. And I will try to relate it a little bit to physical education and sports pedagogy, but that's really not my field. So I'm looking at that area from the perspective of sustainability and education for sustainable development. So starting with sustainable development, some basic idea about it that you may know, but just mentioning the planetary boundaries. I mean, that is one big field here, the idea of the limits of the space, the limits of Earth, the limited carrying capacity of the planet. And I don't want to speak about the details, but it is related to climate change. It is related to loss of biodiversity. So there are different ecological fields where we can see that we are not able, as humanity, on a global space, we are not able to live in that or with that boundaries. On the other hand, and there could be many figures, that's just one example from the area of poverty and poverty reduction. As Anne already said, it's not only about ecological issues, it's about the economics, about social issues. And for example, that figure shows that yes, we have, as a humanity, we have been able to reduce poverty somehow until the pandemics at least, then it changed a bit again. But we also can see in that figure that that's not true for the whole planet, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, the poverty has never been reduced. So yes, there is some success, but there is also a lot of challenges. We could talk about the ecological footprint. There we can see that until the 1970s, as humanity on a global scale, we were still okay, but then more and more we went beyond that limits. And as you can see now with the pandemics, there has been a little reduction, but still we are on a very, very high level and not at all able to live inside those boundaries, ecological boundaries. If I say we could talk about power relations, we could talk about differences, because obviously it's not all human beings on the earth, but it's especially North America, big parts of Europe, Australia, some parts of Asia, which are not living in the side of the boundaries, and other parts of the planet, especially from Latin America, many African countries, which are, well, we could say poor still, or we could say have different living conditions. It depends from country to country. We would find different situation, but we can see that for many of those countries, the ecological footprint is not too high. There are other indicators, like, for example, the Happy Planet Index. The Happy Planet Index, for example, shows that there are some countries, indeed, that are not doing so bad. We could, for example, take the example of Costa Rica. I'm not sure which country exactly, somewhere here in Middle America. Costa Rica, for example, has a quite low ecological footprint on the one hand, but the living standards are not too bad. So it's difficult, because we can see that, because many countries in the world are not able to have a low ecological footprint on the one hand, and on the other hand, good living conditions. But there are some examples, Costa Rica, also some Scandinavian countries that are doing much better than Germany, for example, or probably also than Ireland. I think this sometimes called donut figure is also quite interesting or quite useful here, because it's showing that indeed we could understand sustainable development as a way of trying to find that path in between of the planetary boundaries on the one hand, and on the other hand, these limits of welfare. Because as you can see here, again, it's all the ecological boundaries, but it is, as you mentioned already, it's about health, about social equity, gender equality, and other socioeconomic issues. And so, the question is, how can we find that space for each country, but also as a person, as a community, as a discipline in the university? How can we contribute to finding that, as it said here, safe and just space for humanity? And well, it is a challenge, and nowadays we are still trying and not really good in finding and staying especially in that space. What I think is also very important, and I discuss that a lot with my students, is that, as Anne said, there's different definitions from United Nations, UNESCO, etc. But we also can see that it is a broad discourse. It's not just one green or one left wing or whatever discourse on sustainability. It's a really broad discourse that goes more or less from neoliberal ideas about sustainability, for example, brought forward by European Commission, the actual President von der Leyen, for example, with her idea of green markets, etc., is talking about sustainability, but more from a market-led neoliberal perspective. And on the other hand, on the other extreme, we could find persons like, for example, Vandana Shiva from India. She's an eco-feminist activist. She also may talk about sustainability, about transformation, but from a very different perspective, from an eco-feminist, left-wing, perhaps even socialist perspective. And I think that's important to know, that on the one hand, sustainability is used in science, but on the other hand, it's a political discourse with a lot of power relations, different focuses, struggles for what is sustainability. So you cannot just talk about sustainability and ignore that it is, connected to power relations and to a lot of political issues. I will come back to that later when I say that education for sustainable development is also political education, just because of that situation also. Anne spoke a lot already about the SDGs. I just would like to add that first of all, I also like them a lot because they make it more detailed what sustainability can be. Because some years ago, still many students or colleagues asked me, but what is sustainability? It's so broad, it can be everything. And so the 17 SDGs help us a little bit to make it more detailed, more understandable what sustainability can be. And I think they are also quite interesting because they challenge our idea of development. Sometimes you still see the use of words like developing countries and developed countries, but I think that is totally challenged by the SDGs. Because if you take them serious, there is not even one developed country on earth. At least I would say Germany is not a developed country. Germany is a developing country because of the situation that we are not fulfilling most of the SDGs. We may some. In Germany, for example, we have had very good progress in clean energy. It's amazing how much our energy system has changed. We have not anymore nuclear power. We are shutting down more and more the coal power industry. So yes, for example, there we really have had amazing change during the last 10, 20 years in Germany, but for other areas, climate, life on earth, life in the water, etc., we are still not there at all. Okay, now talking about education for sustainable development, and Anne mentioned some elements there already. I often use that quote, or well, it's not a quote, but these ideas from a German colleague who was an environmental psychologist. And he, about 20 years ago, when he wrote a paper about the differences between environmental education and education for sustainable development, he said that one main focus of ESD, of education for sustainable development, is talking and thinking about the future. What is something what we do sometimes in education, but not so often. Often education is about the past, for example, in history. It's about the present, present engineering, present sports, present law, etc. But sometimes we think about the future, but not so often. And so one idea of ESD really is to make that stronger, to give more space to the future, to use also methods that help students to think about the future. Future of everything, future of society, future of sports, for obviously, future of AI or what else it could be. Then second, the discourse on social values. So open up spaces in which students and in which everybody can think about their own values, values of others, values of people from other countries, and can critically think about their values. And I think especially also in sports pedagogy, there's a lot of spaces where, that is possible, where values can play a role. I will come back to that later. And last but not least, and perhaps even most important in many approaches of ESD, the idea of competence development. Jürgen Rost said that it is about competencies that have not been developed yet, that are have not been strongly developed in the current generation of leaders, of decision makers. And the question is, how can education contribute to developing stronger those competencies in the future, decision makers, politicians, leaders of enterprises and everything. What is, before I come to these competencies, a general idea about different approaches in ESD that are less connected or more to that idea of competencies. We can see in many, especially UNESCO papers, and also many publications from NGOs, we can see that idea that ESD is meant to change behavior. Separating waste, recycling, eating better, doing more sports, for example, or whatever. So there's sometimes a very strong instrumental approach of saying education should improve, education should change the behavior of the students. On the other hand, especially in research, in educational research, we find more that idea of education for sustainable development being emancipatory, so not something that tells people what to do, but that tries to promote, facilitate their critical thinking, so that the students themselves can think about what is better, what action could I take, and not so much telling them how they should change their behavior. In German language, there are even two words for that, Erziehung and Bildung, that goes back to the whole history of educational theory in the German space. In English, I think that the words to use here are instrumental versus a more emancipatory approach. So how can that look like more in detail? There are so many papers about the competencies, but one recent and one that I like very much is that one from colleagues from Arizona State University. They did a Delphi, International Global Delphi study, asking different experts in education for sustainable development which competencies are most important. And I will just go through a little bit that idea here of that first of all, it's system thinking. So to understand the complexity in the world, climate change, globalization, poverty, power relations, all that is very complex. So to help students, depending on their level, depending on their age, obviously that may look very different in early childhood education than in higher education, although the idea is that that competence development starts already in early childhood education, but obviously with less complexity. But then step by step, students can improve their system thinking capacities. As I said already, it's about the future. A main idea here is that it is not one future, it's millions or even more billions of possible futures. And that is what it is about, that students understand the future is not yet defined. The future has not yet been created. It's us, it's every student that can influence the future. That is what future thinking is about, to think about the possibility of different futures. And how we can contribute also to make a more sustainable future happen, or to make a more sustainable future real. There are different methods like backcasting, forecasting, scenario development that can help students to think about the future and to improve their skills in that field. I talked about values already. What is quite important here, because it's not enough just to analyze the current systems and to think about the future. You need also values there, because only based on those values you can decide what changes you would like to see in the present or in the future. What kind of sustainable future you would like to see. Is it more technology-based? Is it more nature-based? I mean, we also know from science fiction that there are many, many different ideas how the future could look like. Living in a very technology-driven world, or a lot of nature, or there are very different ideas of how the future could look like. And we can think about the different futures and the different possibilities, but only based on our values, we could take decisions what we think what would be better, what would be more sustainable. So that is where normative thinking comes in. And then, for example, as soon as a student understands the complexity, is thinking about the future, has some ideas what they would prefer, then they could start developing strategies. So their strategic thinking comes in. Thinking about what could I do first, what could I do better, etc. Who could I approach, with whom could I collaborate, etc. And then, yeah, often students or any people who would like to do something about sustainability will collaborate, so that is where they need cooperation or interpersonal competence. And the idea is that all that leads to action, to implementation. That may look very different. It could be action on campus, it could be action in service learning, as Anne said already. It could be a political action that may look very different. But yes, the idea is that somehow it leads to action. Student-led action, not action predefined by the teachers. And all that is also connected to emotions, to frustration, to hope, to anger, to fear. That is the reason why also intrapersonal competence mindset is included there, because yeah, students may get frustrated, they may have fear for the future or whatever, but there may also be hope. So all that is also connected here, and there are great papers, for example, from a colleague called Maria Ojala from Sweden. She has done amazing research on that issue, how ESD and how the thinking on sustainability is connected to emotional development and also emotional issues. That is one perspective, the competencies. The other one is more that transformative part there we have the idea that on the one hand education can support basic values, can also transmit the idea that we are living in a society where we care about the nature, where human rights are important, justice is important, although today we see more and more countries where that is questioned, just talking about the United States or about Argentina. Also in Germany more and more we have parties that are questioning the importance of human rights, natural protection, etc. But still, I would argue that in most of the constitutions of most countries in the world, these basic values are there, and education should support also socialization processes, education processes linked to those basic values. On the other hand, obviously it is about different ideas, different values and attitudes. Let's take the example of meat consumption. We will not agree all in a classroom or in any setting. We will not agree on meat consumption. Some students and in general, some people may be a vegetarian or vegan or may eat some meat or only fish or whatever. And yes, education should be a space where that can be discussed, where students can reflect on that kind of personal behavior and preferences, but also about political issues, as I said before. So ESD, transformative learning, is about opening up spaces where those values and attitudes can be critically discussed, but like in a safe space. I mean, it should not be fighting. They should not hate each other afterwards. It should be a safe space where those values and attitudes can be reflected on, can be discussed, etc. And in the end, that may lead sometimes also to conceptual change. Although I would say from my perspective, that is not the direct idea of ESD. I would be happy if my students, for example, my classes, further develop their competencies. I would not ask them at the end of the course if they are now vegan or if they have sold their car or whatever. That may happen. I mean, that is, and I obviously have students that tell me, oh, now I'm thinking more critically about using my car or whatever. That happens, but I would not describe that as a direct learning outcome that I intend. It's not an intended learning outcome of my classes, but on a longer term, we may see such conceptual change. But often, I mean, that is also described by people like Mezirow or others who have done research about transformative learning. They describe that kind of transformative learning is a longer process. And often it's also linked to crisis. People that go through a stronger crisis often have a stronger change. That can be seen on a personal level, but you can see also that on a more societal level. Let's, for example, take the accidents of Chernobyl or Fukushima. After those accidents, nuclear power accidents, many people changed their values and attitudes towards nuclear power, for example. So we can see that kind of conceptual change individually and even sometimes on a societal basis. Now coming back to that political idea, I would say yes, ESD is also citizenship education, is also political education for different reasons. First of all, you cannot separate sustainability from political issues. It's totally political. I mean, you can see it every day on the newspapers, on media, etc. Climate change and all the other sustainability topics, they are strongly connected to political issues. So you also in a classroom with students, you cannot talk about it and leave political issues totally outside. Well, you could try to, but I think that would be totally wrong, because then also students would miss their chance to see it as a political issue and to discuss it as a political issue. In Germany, we always have a strong discussion on that, but on the issue, on the question, what does that mean for the teacher, especially for school teachers? Are they allowed to talk about political issues? And there are some people saying, no, they shouldn't, and that could be dangerous. I think, and many others think, they should, because also teachers are citizens. They are political, they are socialized in a political way. Obviously, they shouldn't tell their students for which party to vote for. That would be totally unethical and not okay. That would be indoctrination. But why should a teacher not say, I'm vegetarian? Or I think we should be more radical about climate change? And why should a teacher not say in the moment that a student questions climate change and says that it's fake news, why should a teacher then not say clearly, no, that's wrong, you are wrong. We have a lot of scientific data showing that climate change exists, and if you neglect it, you're part of a political movement, but it's not a scientific, valid information when you are saying climate change does not exist. But that are the questions there. And I mean, you can tell me more perhaps from the perspective of physical education, sports pedagogy, how you look at that topic. But I think in general, in teacher education and school education and higher education, it's a very interesting question how to deal with those questions. I think it's somehow easy if it is students' opinion or positions that are non-academic, that are totally against research results. I think it's also somehow easy if it's about discriminating positions, because then I think it's totally clear that as a teacher you have to say, no, that's not okay here. We do not act against human rights. We are not racist, etc. There it's easy. It's more easier, but not anymore perhaps. I mean, thinking about the United States and what Trump is doing, I think more and more it even becomes difficult to see a school as a non-racist place. But I think even more it's difficult for all the tiny issues related to mobility, meat consumption, etc. There it's also very, it's interesting how to work on that with students, bringing and letting in also political issues. But another reason why we should do that and we should think about it is not only because it is political, also I think it's because it would be unfair to see it only as an issue of consumption. And often that happens. Often in education, also my students, when I ask them, please create a project about sustainability, often they think only about consumption-related issues. They want to work with the students about the life cycle of the genes, about bees, about many other issues that are important, but they are leaving totally outside the structural issues. And I think that is a big problem, because in the moment that you work with students, also children, and you tell them, or at least the idea is created there, perhaps you don't tell them as a teacher, but at least the idea is there, it's on them to create the change. They have to buy in a different way. They have to convince their parents when they're children to buy different products. And yes, somehow that's true, they could do that, they could change their consumption behavior, for example, but will that really create the transformation we need? No, it won't. Also because as consumers, it's totally impossible to make real change, because often there are not even alternatives. Often you are there in the supermarket and you even don't know which fruit would be now more sustainable. Is it the apple from, I don't know, Ireland, or is it the apple from New Zealand? The answer would be it depends, and you cannot know if you do not do a big research project on it. You will not find the necessary information there in the supermarket to take a sustainable decision. So often it is structural questions. It's questions that are much bigger than what the individual students could do. And that, as I said, does not mean that they cannot act. It does not mean that we should talk about consumption, but it means that we also should talk about structures. We should not only address individual issues, but also structural issues, and should also enhance the agency of citizens, not only of consumers. That is what I'm trying to do in my classes. When we talk about sustainability, we talk about consumption, we talk about private issues, daily life issues, etc. But we also talk about the systemic questions, about structural questions, about political questions. Okay, all that cannot be conveyed, it cannot be transmitted. As Weinert said, competencies cannot be taught. Competencies can only be developed by the students. So what we need here is action-oriented, transformative pedagogy, as Anne already said, service learning, project-based learning, experience-based learning, what else? Problem-based learning, etc. Because only in that way students can experience, students can develop their own competencies, can think about their values. It's not possible that a teacher just talks them through the values or teaches them different competencies. It has to be the students who should be active and think about the values, develop their competencies. All that is not only linked to classroom activities, it's also about the institution. That is what we call the whole institution approach. Why? Because the whole institution is a learning space, and it does not make sense that it does not make much sense, for example, to talk about sustainability in the classroom, and then the students leave the classroom and go on campus, go to the canteen or whatever, and there find only unsustainable opportunities, unsustainable spaces. It makes more sense that we could find or see there's some coherence, some consistency, that also the operations are as sustainable as possible, that campus life is as sustainable as possible, that community relations are linked to sustainability issues. So that is the idea here, that sustainability is also a learning space on campus. That is also about informal learning, it's about incidential learning. Students, for example, going to a canteen, finding their vegan food options, lunch options. They are not taught about it, they are not told that is vegan and you should eat it or whatever, but just being there, just seeing vegan options, for example, is also a space for learning, informal learning, peer group learning, etc. There are some recent studies that also show that if there is a whole institution approach, and if the sustainability or the university or the school is a sustainable institution that supports very much the learning process of the students, it leads also to statistically significant learning outcomes that are not only limited to the university, but also spread out to other fields of action. Yeah, now for the last part, and as I said before, I'm not an expert at all in physical education and sports pedagogy, but I also looked a little bit at the literature, and at the moment we are publishing a German handbook, a German-speaking handbook on education for sustainable development with some colleagues from Switzerland, Austria, and Germany, and in that book we will publish also one piece, one chapter, especially on ESD and sports education, and I especially looked at that chapter, taking some ideas from there to bring them in here. First of all, if we look at sport, we can see it as a victim of unsustainable development. I mean, for example, there may be health issues and and you all have seen that, and I guess also in Ireland that's the case, that especially in summer, if it gets hotter or etc., there may be health risk, for example. But also, the sports facilities. In Bremen, for example, where I come from, the big soccer stadium is very close to the river. And so they are already discussing, okay, can it stay there? Or what happens if there are bigger floods in the future? And it has happened already that soccer stadium has been flooded sometimes in a flood situation. So that is one question here. For example, linked to climate change. But on the other hand, we also can say sport as such is also contributing to ecological, to social problems. For example, creating waste, creating CO2 emissions, especially if we think about the big sports events like international competition, Olympic games, etc. And we all have seen that it is always discussed, also going to those countries like the Emirates or whatever, where it's really like, okay, make it really sense to create new sports facilities in the desert or something like that? So there is a big question of in how far sport facilities, sport events are contributing, for example, to climate change. On the other hand, and Anne has been talking about that already, the question is in how far sports can contribute to the SDGs. Obviously to health and well-being, that is quite obvious, but also to quality education, gender equality. I always see that, for example, our son plays soccer, and we always see that it is not only boys, it is also girls. It's perhaps even a more gender diverse group of young people involved into sports. So yes, there is this gender equality, but it may be also about sustainable cities. How does a city look like in which people can move, can be active in a healthy way, can find parks where they can do sports or whatever. So it is also about cities and communities, but also about consumption. I said that already, and how far sports events, facilities can be designed in a sustainable way and can also contribute to that idea of SDG 12. So one dimension is the sustainable design of sports activities. They should be as environmental friendly as possible, resource efficient and socially responsible. But sports also can be a platform for promoting and supporting sustainable development and social transformation. For example, instilling values such as fairness, teamwork, respect, inclusion, and spoke about that already. All that is, I think, quite easy. At least, for example, the trainer of our son in soccer, the soccer trainer is always talking about team play, about respect, and all these values, but also strengthening social integration. I think especially in cities and multi-diverse cities, multicultural cities, and I also see that in our city, Bremen, which is a very international, very multicultural city. We have many young children from refugee families, from families that have come from all over the world. More than 50 or 60% of the students at the first grade do not speak German when they come into, or not perfectly at least, but there are even many that do not speak German at all, but many that have at least a lack of capacities and speak in Germany, and their sports plays a big role. For example, our son now will enter school in August, and it is a primary school which has struggles a lot with that multicultural international context, because it's very difficult for the teachers to work with 20-25 young children coming from very different religious, cultural backgrounds, speaking different language. And so that school, for example, says in our school, a main focus is sport, because that is a place where everybody can take part, where everybody can be, where everybody somehow independent from the language skills at the first place. And in that way, sports clubs or also physical education in school, the school as such, I spoke about that before, can be seen as role models, or should be seen as role models for sustainability. And last but not least, then the question, how can education, physical education, sport pedagogy be related to that field? I think somehow, especially in primary school, where we probably do not yet talk about very complex issues like globalizations and climate change, perhaps not as much, at least like in secondary education, but at least, as I said before, we can have spaces where values as tolerance, solidarity, fair play, conflict resolution, etc. can be experienced, can be practiced, especially in secondary school, but perhaps even already sometimes in primary school. There may be spaces where we can have reflection, service learning projects or whatever on topics like sportswear, production, supply chain, consumption, etc. Then I think also quite interesting is the question how movement and tagging games, etc., can help to think about complex issues. That is also a big issue when we connect ESD to inclusive education. I spoke already about the very diverse and heterogeneous group of students and how they can be prepared for learning. Then I think, movement is very important in that context. It could also be, for example, in that paper that I'm using here, they are talking about that and how far also physical activity can be used as a space, as a moment where students can engage also with sustainability knowledge, for example, in running quiz or other activities where cognitive activities are combined with physical activity. Outdoor activities where it is about overcoming physical challenges, climbing or other ways of outdoor challenges can be linked to thinking about the sustainability, or also embodied learning where we could use movement or dance theater or other activities linked to embodied learning to make visible, to express ideas on ecological issues, on societal issues, etc., modified sports games. There are many ideas how embodied learning can be used in the context of ESD. To come to an end, I would like to conclude that, as also Anne said, I think the field is still developing. Biology, geography are much more advanced. They talked about sustainability 20 years ago already. I think physical education, sport pedagogy is still more emerging, but there is a lot already, and also showed a lot of research that has been especially recently published. And I'm looking forward to collaborating with you, Anne, and the whole group, Antonio, everybody in that field. And I'm also looking forward to our discussions today. Thank you very much.